So, being Saturday night, it's become a tradition at these retreats that I answer the questions that are left over from our online Sangha members. But I want to start by asking those here if you have any burning questions, so I make sure that none of you are unable to get your questions answered and your doubts cleared. If any of the content that has been transmitted so far has not been clear, then please feel free to ask. If not, then we shall proceed. First question, I continue to choose God, to know God, but I bounce up and down the ladder of discourse. At times there is so much despair, and I wonder if I just need to wait for grace. What are your thoughts on this? Well, the despair is caused by a particular discourse, and usually it's a discourse of feeling the absence of God and the rule of evil forces and the sense of hopelessness about the world. All of this is a fiction, and that discourse can only bring despair, and it has no reality. So when those kinds of narratives arise, one must witness them and recognize that they are not coming from within. They are a reaction that comes from a false self that feels a lack of power to deal with reality and to cope with the stresses and the sense of the chaos of the world. But when you recognize that the world is a dream and that you are the dreamer, you are no longer trapped in it, and you enter that state that we were in meditation of silent presence, witnessing the ego, and it can no longer arise. It cannot disturb your peace, and despair or any other negative emotion that the ego might be feeling is immediately extinguished. It's put to sleep. When the self is awake, the ego sleeps. When the self is asleep, the ego is awake. And it's the ego's Saturday night. And you don't want to be there for that. You want to be on the self's Saturday night. That's a very different celebration. So that would be my answer, is the stillness of self-realization will, and since you start by saying you continue to choose God and to know God, that choice will overrule the emotional reaction of the ego. And it will bring grace. Second question, as we approach Sat Yuga, transcending to the Godhead seems inevitable. Who get the chance to live in Sat Yuga? Well, okay, according to all of the sages' teachings, if you are, while alive before the end of Kali Yuga, if you have reached self-realization and become the manifestation of Satchit Ananda, you become an avatar of the God Self. And it's that state of consciousness then which resonates with the consciousness of Sat Yuga, and you will naturally enter into that mode of being which is a heavenly realm of magic and miracle and beauty and joy and perfection. And so the self is easily able to be translated into a Sat Yuga body and enjoy the reward of the efforts of the Sat Yoga that you did in the previous life. And your vibrational frequency is able to support and sustain Sat Yuga. So naturally, you would be sent to that location in the space-time continuum of the dream field. However, if you did not awaken to that level and your consciousness remained as a Kali Yuga ego, then indeed when the world dream is withdrawn from its manifest form and all return to the unmanifest state of the absolute self, the Godhead, prior to and beyond time and space, when there is no world in that timeless state, yes, the consciousness enters, but because the sanskaras were not burned, those sanskaras remain in a state of suspended animation. And then one's soul will have to wait to come back into the world at a time, to wait for a time in which the world vibrates with conditions that will enable those sanskaras to fit in and to find a way to satisfy the inherent desires of those sanskaras, which basically will mean you probably won't be reborn until the next Kali Yuga. If you have done a little bit or even a lot of yogic practice but haven't got to realization of the self, you may have gotten to a copper age level of consciousness or a silver age level in your love of God and your adoration of divine beauty and goodness and purity, etc. And your consciousness will leave the body in that vibrational frequency and go into suspended animation with whatever sanskaras are there from that time period of your own past soul history, and will come back at a time that is resonant with that frequency that you have reached. Okay, so everyone will find themselves in a world in which their sanskaras are suitable, let's say, and make sense, because it's a world that will offer opportunities for satisfaction, or at least for the quest for satisfaction. You won't get none, but you'll at least be in a world in which it's offered. But if you're in a Kali Yuga frame of mind, you would not fit into Sat Yuga. You wouldn't. The vibrations of that time would be so non-resonant that it would shatter the consciousness. It would not be able to endure the beauty. It would be like being facing God in a surround mode in which the eyes of God were looking at you from everywhere, and you couldn't handle the shame, the guilt, the sense of unworthiness, and there would be a shriveling into nothingness. So you would only enter into Sat Yuga when your consciousness is divinized. Okay, so I hope that answers the question. When the shadow is coming up to be released, I feel intense pain and suffering of myself and all beings. How can I stay in this presence with love to allow these emotions to be released. Well, again, one has to recognize that it's not your shadow, it's the ego's shadow, and feel compassion and feel love and acceptance and learn from it. Turn the suffering into information, because the suffering is based on a narrative which always has false assumptions to it. And when you are able to see the false belief that has sustained that shadow figure or that sense of a suffering entity, then by piercing through that illogical and incoherent belief, it is released. And then the light shines through the shadow and dissolves it. So it's a combination of compassion and divine love and of the wisdom to recognize the illusion and to not buy into it. So there must be a very powerful, coherent, logical capacity to deconstruct the illusory form. Are people who love God still in danger of getting stuck in locating themselves in very lower ego assemblage points and remaining there indefinitely? Also, is asking yourself the question, who am I, a possible means to get out of those realms? Well, yes, I think as we just expressed, not simply asking the question, but realizing the answer. Realizing it because the answer can't come in words, because the real self is inconceivable. There are no words that can express or describe that, but silent, still presence completely eliminates those lower assemblage point narratives and feeling states. So if you love God, you're already in a relatively high assemblage point, and that love, if it is combined with faithfulness to the service of God, which is why karma yoga is so important on the path, will get you out of whatever stuckness, because you will be functioning for something greater than yourself. And by being in an altruistic state of giving, that generosity of spirit that pours out love for all, because all are manifestations of God, is what breaks through the narcissistic, defensive posture of the ego. Can a person who has a grave mental health diagnosis achieve a state of mental equanimity required to awaken? I am a recovering alcoholic and I'm on medication for bipolar disorder. Well, again, it's very important to recognize that the psychological self, that is the ego, is not the real self. The ego is complex, it's made up of different parts, and that's why it has this bipolarity, and it is not in control of itself, but reacts to subconscious forces and to projective forces that it externalizes, and is in a state of instability. But that is not you. And so the key to getting out of that is, don't believe the diagnosis, because that's only a medical establishment, ideological way of of weakening you and turning you into a victim of the system, because in truth there's no such thing as a mental disorder that is based on chemistry or any other factors other than your own sensors choosing to withhold certain information and to focus on certain false beliefs that produce anger, hatred, despair, depression, and then a manic compensation into Superman or Superwoman in order to try to escape from that. But this bipolar pattern does not exist in the real self, and once you have attained a place of witnessing it, then the two polarities become unified, and in that non-duality of a monopole consciousness, then the stability of presence is established. So the answer is yes. Don't think that any diagnosis or any past history has any power to prevent you from realizing your freedom in the present. This question is more difficult to summarize. Can you speak more on the effects from an abusive father? That's very difficult because it's so individualized. First of all, I don't have enough information because a father-son relationship will have different conditions than a father-daughter relationship. Was the abuse verbal? Was it physical? Was it sexual? And what was the mother's relationship to the father? Was she an accomplice? Was she weak? Was she, what was the couple relationship? And were there siblings involved? And were you witnessing cruelty to them as well? Or were you the scapegoat? And there are so many aspects to the family system that everyone's reaction to abusive parenting, it will be different. And I recommend that you work through the individual decisions that were made as a result of that abuse and the internal identification with the aggressor that may also have produced a very severe and attacking superego that you may also sometimes identify with. And so whatever is the original situation will have produced unique effects upon the ego construct. But again, the simplicity of the real self can overcome whatever of those tendencies are disturbing your peace. And when you recognize that the ego has nothing to do with you, and you were not abused because this is only a dream, you're not really in it, you were dreaming it, and you had a reason to dream it, and a trajectory of growth to a higher state of consciousness that required going through that test to overcome whatever anger, bitterness, fear, or other kind of effect that it has had on the ego, to overcome it and be victorious. And through that, to gain a kind of capacity for compassion and forgiveness and love that could only come as a result of going through the rite of passage, of letting go of whatever traces of hatred or self-hatred or of loss of faith in the goodness of the real has resulted from that. And that is the way to then reestablish your divine beingness. Is it possible to heal from our traumas? Yes, absolutely, of course. And you have to realize they're not your traumas, they're the ego's traumas. You are simply a witness who was never affected by it. Because the real self is not ever victimized. And it is important that you recognize that the I is a consciousness that is all-encompassing. You contain your body and the whole world that appears in your consciousness and is your consciousness, but you are not limited to any identity within the consciousness. And so those traumas, which are now simply memory traces that have become sanskaras, have no power over you, and your ability to burn them and to eliminate them it can never be taken away. But there does have to be a choice to recognize that you are the unborn self, and then nothing to do with the traumatized ego can affect you. Okay. How can we differentiate between apathy and non-attachment? Interesting question. You know, the word apathy comes from apatheia, which is a very famous term in Christian monasticism. It comes from the Greek fathers of the church. And it's the highest state you can reach. Apatheia is the equivalent of vairagya. And so you can have two kinds of apathy. One is, I don't care what happens in the world because it's only a dream. It's of no interest to me. My only interest is God, and I'm in bliss regardless of what is occurring. And I have awakened from the dream, and the dream is no longer my focus. And all I see is light and love and joy and God's presence everywhere. And that's apatheia, in which there can be no disturbance. Sometimes it's translated as passionlessness. It can be either one, but it is that overcoming of suffering and of reactivity. So, however, the other kind of more nihilistic apathy comes from a depressive psychological condition in which one feels hopeless and that it's not worth participating or contributing creatively because one doesn't have anything to offer, one is empty of any goodness or creative power, and the world doesn't deserve anything you would give it anyway. So it's a narrative, it's a discourse that will produce the effect of that kind of negative apathy. But as soon as there is non-attachment to the ego, the lower apathy turns into apatheia. Next question, is it possible that the ego can go into a psychosis as a defense mechanism when the energy of presence and silence becomes too strong? Interesting question. I don't think you could, first of all, go into psychosis as a defense mechanism. It would be the failure of your defense mechanisms. But you can only fall into psychosis if you have a latent psychotic structure, or at least a fragment of the ego structure is in a psychotic state. If that is not the case, you can't fall into psychosis, no matter what conditions, no matter how big a dose of a drug you took, or how you're tortured, or whatever. You won't fall into psychosis if that structure had not already been in place. You may fall into other states of paranoia or terror or whatever, but the psychotic structure has a very particular origin and a lack of coping that is based on not having achieved a capacity to triangulate or to master the signifier chain in order to modify discourse and free oneself from an initial core of hatred of an intolerable situation of lack of love, in which the world no longer makes sense. And then one falls into a delusional state that can make sense in its own fantasy of the senseless behavior that's being experienced. But if that structure had not been developed in childhood, then it's not going to happen. However, many people are not aware that they have a latent psychotic structure or fragment of a structure. So there could be that kind of a possibility that takes one by surprise. And therefore, it wouldn't happen as a result of one's energy of presence. That would not trigger the psychosis. All that would trigger is an avoidance of the energy that becomes a threat to the ego's defenses against love. But it would not produce psychosis. Other kinds of stresses would be required to do that. I don't think anyone has ever gone psychotic from meditation. I think we're relatively safe in that regard. When filled with unyielding compassion, an interesting phrase, how can one in silence survive while surrounded by those who exploit and deceive? I suppose this is a question that maybe a lot of people do have as they see the rule of demonic forces at this period in Kali Yuga. And there is a lot of exploitation and deception at every level that is happening. But one must not make a narrative about it. And if you are in a state of compassion that is based on wisdom, and you recognize that this is a drama and a dream, you will understand that your compassion and your detachment and your refusal to let go of your peace of mind and of your emanation of divine love is the challenge that is your rite of passage in life. To not become what your enemy is like. So if you were to suddenly become from compassionate to angry and violent, you would become as bad as those that you were complaining about. So when you recognize that exploitation, deception, or whatever is your own consciousness and traces of a sanskara that are only there because you were also an accomplice in the fall of consciousness into the Kali Yuga state, then what it should do is to prompt a greater purification of the self, so that the dream is modified in accord with that, and then you'll find that life brings you into different circumstances in which that kind of activity is no longer impinging on your space. How do you foresee the situation of Earth's social structures in the upcoming years? Well, I don't see too many years ahead, because the social structures are decomposing before our eyes very rapidly, and the forces behind this collapsing global culture, or lack of culture, but a dying civilization, are being engineered deliberately by forces that want to make the human species extinct, and to take over the planet for the use of these forces, which are not human in nature. And so there is a collapse and a death of a global sort that is coming, as well as a rebirth. But don't depend on the apparatuses of the state and the social order to be there for you, whether it's the medical establishment, which I think most people already know is very dangerous and not necessarily benign, but all of the social apparatuses, whether they're police departments, judicial systems, systems of justice of whatever kind, any sort of order, of law, of safety, and of dependability, it's all about to disappear. Even food will no longer be on the shelves of stores and such. So everything you might have taken for granted to survive will be taken away, and that's why we must learn to depend only on God. Many times I can see clearly that people are not their bodies. It's very obvious. Nonetheless, I do not recognize this in myself. I can't have the same vision about myself. Why is this? That's a strange question, but on the other hand, we have been indoctrinated not to see ourselves or experience or imperience our consciousness as being separate from the vehicle that it is operating. The fact that you can see this as being the case with others, to me, means you're very close to being able to also see that in yourself, because it is a projection. And once you recognize that the other cannot really be different than you, if you see others as souls with bodies, then you will clearly be able to perceive that in your own case. But what it probably will require is a very deep meditation in which you reach a sense of bodilessness, and you can establish yourself in that state. And it is a particular vibrational frequency that you will, it's unmistakable, and it comes when you have stilled the mind, and the consciousness is then free of its identification and its localization within the body. How can we deal with the pull toward drugs of all sorts, whether it's food, promiscuity, nicotine, alcohol, etc., that one has been exposed to in the past. Well, first of all, I wouldn't create a narrative that one is an addict or that one is helpless in the face of the attraction of these things. But I also wouldn't villainize the drugs. If you really reflect on why you are attracted to a certain substance, it's always going to be because of the psychological effects it produces. It may make you more peaceful. It may make you less inhibited. It may make you feel more free and at home in the world. It may free your intelligence to be able to think more clearly or deeply. Each drug has a certain effect that is there to overcome a lack that is produced by a particular discourse and a particular self-image in which certain qualities of consciousness are lacking and require an external input of a chemical substance or some other kind of stimulation in order to enable that to emerge. And once you recognize that you don't need the drug for your fix, but you can fix that lack simply through changing the narrative, and then you'll find that you don't require the substance. Your natural state is joy. Happiness is what we are. Love is what we are. And a state of fulfillment when we are in recognition of our true nature. So the need or the feeling of desperation that comes with that sense of addictive destabilization if we don't get this thing is a kind of a perverse fixation on a fetish in which we have projected certain qualities of consciousness onto this thing or this situation or this other without which or without whom I feel a lack of wholeness and of feeling peace, security, stability, joy, whatever, and recognizing that no, it's produced by a narrative, not by reality, and you will free yourself from that need. I want to purify myself, go to higher realms, and yet the sanskaras pull me to old patterns very strongly sometimes. I'm able to restrain myself for months on end, but eventually I fall back down to fulfill a very strong craving for a drug. Okay, the same pattern repeats itself. This is, I think it might even be from the same person, this the second aspect. But again, it is the narrative that puts you in a situation of needing to restrain yourself. So there's an internal battle with an ego fragment that thinks it requires this substance for its sense of wholeness. And once that narrative is gone, the pattern won't repeat. And then I think there's a follow-up to that, which is it's nice to shut up that screaming mind, which is that part of the ego that demands the addictive objet and those craving emotions by giving it what it wants. But then when the experience is over, shame and guilt creeps in. And that's always the punchline to every ego narrative. It blames itself, it feels shame and guilt for its weakness, its dependency, its failure to support itself in a noble manner that does not compromise and betray itself and lose its self-sovereignty. So again, this is part of the discourse of lack that the ego was indoctrinated into in childhood when it was dependent upon the parents and dependent upon certain signifiers of goodness, without which one would be emotionally destabilized. And then later, those signifiers get projected onto the addictive substance. So, through recognition of your wholeness, that pattern also will be released. Okay, well, I think that's the list. Was this useful to anyone else other than those who asked the questions? Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad that it's valuable for the whole sangha. Are there any others that came in since then?